Welcome, everybody. It's time once again for the next chapter with Charlie Hedges as he explores turning the page on his life and yours. Hey, Charlie.
Hey, Paul. You know, I'll tell you what, we have a great show for our listeners today. Our guest, informally known as the Master of Disaster, is socio-economist Dr. Randall Bell, who is an internationally recognized trauma specialist. Dr. Bell helps people survive and even thrive after experiencing a traumatic event or series of traumatic events in their lives. I like this description I found on the back cover of his book. Today, we see crime, abuse, alcoholism, drugs, anger, and anxiety everywhere. This, Dr. Bell says, is a result of unresolved trauma. Ultimately, the quality of our lives depends on our ability to successfully process our heartbreaks and our catastrophes. On our show today, Dr. Bell offers insights to help you create a game plan for post-traumatic thriving, which is also the title of his latest book. So with that, let's bring on our guest, Randall Bell. Welcome to the next chapter with Charlie.
Hey, Charlie, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks.
Yeah, I look forward to our conversation. You know, today, this is an interesting way to open the show. Today's show, I want to focus, obviously, on trauma and your latest book, Post-Traumatic Thriving. But as a side note, before we even do the show, I want to invite you back to another show on an entirely different subject based on another book of yours, in which you say money can buy you happiness and it doesn't have to be expensive. I love the diversity of your thought.
Yeah, it's kind of true. You got to pay your bills, but to be happy, you don't have to be a billionaire. The statistics prove that.
Yeah, they really do. And it's funny, we have this funny relationship with talking about money. And I was just talking to the receptionist downstairs, and we were talking about money and how, you know how they have all these surveys that say what makes workers happy at their job, you know, what they want most in their job. And money typically ranks somewhere between 5 and 9. And I just say that's baloney. You know, they want diversity, and they want this, and they want that. So I'll tell you what, you take away diversity, they're going to complain. You take away their salary, they're gone. Don't tell me money is not the most important thing in a job.
Yeah, point well taken.
So for today, as I was doing my research on you, and I mentioned in the intro, I found the title Master of Disaster. Now, I don't know if that's a compliment or if that's meant a shot at you. I don't know how in the world did you ever acquire such a description?
Well, the LA Times came up with that. There was an article on my career, and it led off with that, sentence, calling me the Master of Disaster. At first, I really didn't like it, and I avoided it, but it kind of kept catching on, and I kept hearing more and more of that comment. And I thought, you know what, let's just go with it. Let's instead of fighting it, And so when I speak to youth groups or something, or high schools, I hand out Master of Disaster baseball caps, and, you go with it.
That's great. So you teach high school kids with this as well?
Yeah, not as a formal teacher, but yeah, I get to.
That's what I mean, a guest lecturer or something?
Yeah, exactly. So I like it.
That is great. So tell me, what does the Master of Disaster do?
Well, I'm a socio-economist, which means that when there's a disaster, I go in and I compute the dollars caused by the disasters. We worked on hurricanes where we have 30,000 homeowners, for example, and the court system does not, and the insurance industries don't award apologies or hugs or anything like that. They award dollars and only dollars, and so I compute those dollars. But in the process, Charlie, I've met the people behind the statistics, and I've learned their stories, and I've really been personally interested in that more than the numbers. So that's what kind of led to the book and my fascination with why after a disaster, some people die, some people survive, and some people thrive.
As we delve more into the ramifications and implications of trauma, you know what I thought where we might begin, Randall, is perhaps by asking you to let's start out on a level playing field, and let's understand your definition of trauma, and so everybody knows where we're coming from in this discussion.
Well, trauma comes from all kinds of sources, whether I call them the difficult Ds in the book: death, disease, divorce, destruction, on and on. But whatever that stimulus is in scientific terms, is something that causes us to turn off our outer human brains and turn on our inner reptilian brains, which is very much based on instinct. And our instinctual brains react to trauma with a fight, flight, freeze instinct, where we either fight the lion, we freeze and hope the lion doesn't see us, or we run from the lion. And that instinct, which is usually accompanied with shock, is what keeps us, nature's way of keeping us safe. And so trauma is anything that causes that response. The problem is when the trauma passes, if we don't take proper steps, we can be triggered and have the exact same response from the memory of that trauma, even though we're really not being chased by a lion. And that's why you hear stories about soldiers who hit the deck when a car backfires and that kind of thing. There's something in the base of the brain that has not been dealt with that brings upon that instinctual response.
So like many things that we deal with in our life, when it comes to handling that part of the brain and the ego even, it's a self-protection mechanism, is it not?
Oh, that's exactly what it is. It's a way to get to safety. I mean, safety is the very basic of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and this is nature's way of getting us away from danger or any kind of traumatic circumstance.
And you get into it more deeply. It's without truly investigating what the cause is or the event that brings that about. There's no evaluation. It's just instinctual reaction.
Usually that's primarily what it is, and oftentimes entirely what it is. The outer human brain turns off. The mid-level brain, which is the mammal brain, which is emotion-driven, that even turns off, and it's all instinct. It's just, how do I get out of this alive? And nothing else matters except for that.
Yeah. It's so instinctual, it doesn't even truly hit our conscious selves, does it? It's acting underneath our conscious selves that we don't even really know we're responding in a certain way.
Yeah, exactly. That's why there's such a memory gap associated with trauma, where people their memories are distorted, or they even don't remember some horrific event, and the memories are repressed. It's because that whatever happened didn't take place in the outer human brain, where we normally store our actions and thoughts. This happens at a reptilian level, where we're not thinking clearly. It's, again, just get to safety, stay alive, and survive.
You know what occurs to me, and as I'm listening to you explain this, and this is the first I've really ever discussed this subject, is that the traumatic experiences as an adult, and ones that I'm thinking of are the ones that come from our soldiers and in war zones, but things like divorce or especially death of a child, those we remember and we know we can identify as, whether we ever call them trauma or not, but experiences that certainly impact our lives significantly. But you know what I'm thinking about? I'm thinking about, we talked ever so briefly about childhood trauma, and there's got to be isn't there, it would seem to me to be a lot of trauma experienced is not recognized in adulthood. A lot of childhood traumatic experiences Many are recognized, but some are not. We don't even know that they're impacting us. Do you find that to be true?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And childhood traumas are particularly problematic, and oftentimes they're stuffed down, they're repressed. And so, in my case, my childhood trauma is I was born with a congenital heart defect, and I had open heart surgery when I was 11. And I know, speaking from my own experience, I hated talking about it. I didn't like when the topic came up, and I would quickly change the subject. And that's a very common response. It's also that's not the right response. That's not how we successfully deal with these issues. Is stuffing them down, but that response is very common.
You know, personally, all my listeners know I come from a rather I've never called it traumatic childhood, but a very difficult childhood of not having a home, of being abandoned, being rejected, living with different people, and all that can happen, between all that can cause between the ages of 3 and 8 years old. And I read somewhere that people that have abandonment issues, there are 2 fears that are very prominent in that case, and that is rejection, which was obvious to me. I have a great fear of rejection because feeling rejected so much as a kid, but also shame. It had rejection and shame, and I had never associated shame with the trauma of my youth, and yet in the last couple of years it has emerged, and I see it going back to 6, 7 years old. And, things that occurred to me or that I did are almost debilitatingly shameful acts that they, I want to run or at best freeze. I don't have the energy to fight. So I'm either flight or freeze. What thoughts do you have on that?
Yeah, shame's a biggie, and that's what I felt with my situation too, was a lot of shame. I learned when I was really getting into this several years ago, I was volunteering at the San Quentin prison, and the inmates there taught me the difference between guilt and shame, and they're very different things. Shame is something that happened to us that we had no responsibility in, like our families were in poverty. In my case, open heart surgery, these were not a child's responsibility, and a child would have no control over that. Childhood abuse would be another one. Guilt is where we did something wrong, and they're very, very different. And understanding that difference is part of the healing process.
Yeah, don't you think, though, I'm wondering, when it comes to shame, I didn't know we were going to, wasn't even anticipating getting into shame. And I, as I told you, this is very conversational, and I don't even know where we're going. But with shame, it can be attributed to actions that the child did or that I did, but that were brought on or created from all the rejection. It was a means to gather acceptance. So you see, so it's kind of a guilt and kind of a shame thing at the same time. So you get, in that case, it seems to me that both of them apply. Have you ever looked at it that way?
I haven't. I mean, like I say, the difference is the child's guilty, or any person is guilty when we conscientiously do something wrong. But if we were put in a tough situation as a kid, particularly, it's usually not guilt, it's shame, because the circumstances were kind of handed to the child. So it's, like I say, it's important to make the distinction where we did something wrong versus it's just who we are, or what happened to us, but not really a choice we made.
Very helpful. You know what I think would be good is I think our audience, I'm realizing I have, I've listened to interviews with you and read up in your book, and you have been a part of very significant traumatic events in the United States and around the world. Can you describe, your activity, what you learned, what you experienced from something like the World Trade Center or Hurricane Katrina, or whatever particular circumstance comes to mind? How do you why do they call you? What is it about Dr. Randall Bell that they say, this is the expert we need to talk to?
Well, I get called because I compute the numerical damages for legal claims or insurance claims, but what keeps me kind of plugged into these cases is recognizing in this position, and we're talking everything from the World Trade Center to the O.J. Simpson case and everything in between, is that the world's a tough place. And I was in a unique situation to be, and continue to be in this unique situation where I'm behind the scenes on all these cases, and I meet the people, and given the fact that the world's pretty messed up, I dug in to do the research on how we can make things a little bit better, instead of just kind of saying, wow, that's a really big disaster, and that's that. I'm always looking for solutions, and maybe we can even help some people going through traumas and these conditions, rather than just saying, wow, that's really too bad, and that's that. And the realization on the big picture is that the science is so good, and there's been so much research done on the physiology of the brain, the trauma responses, what works and what doesn't work, that this information needs to be made available to more than just the academics that study this and do the research. It needs to be made available to everyone. And the problem is, Charlie, these skills are generally not taught in school, and yet by college age, 66 to 85% of folks will have been exposed to at least one trauma. And by the time you're my age, it's 100%. And so these skills are just essential to learn. And while the schools aren't teaching them, it's kind of my mission to talk about it as we're talking about it now, to write the book, to discuss it, and open up the conversation so that more and more people can heal and maybe even make the world a little bit better.
No, it's such a wonderful goal, and you're right. When I think of post-traumatic, I think of them. I don't think of me. It's never really occurred that it's me. But at 73 years old, and with your research, you're bound to say, Charlie, it is you. There have been trauma, and I look at my childhood, and I look at other experiences that I can reflect on that are trauma-inducing. And I don't think many of us, Randall, look at it that way. I think, because we're so focusing on post-traumatic syndrome and wars, those seem to be synonymous, that we don't really look at trauma widely enough or intimately enough that all of us have experienced trauma, and yet, like I said, we think of it as them instead of us.
Yeah, and it's funny you say that, because I wrote the book and thought I was done with the manuscript, and long story short, a friend invited me to climb Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa, and I went for a checkup and found out I had new heart issues, and I met with my cardiologist, and again, long story short, I found out I was suffering PTSD from never having emotionally healed from my childhood heart issues. And she was very holistic and taught me some skills that went, way outside of Western medicine that got me dealing with the real issues and healing, totally healed from that. And so in writing the book, I had to go back, and it's kind of funny, Charlie, but I had to rewrite the whole manuscript from a kind of a tone of a professorial tone of, you need to do this and you need to do that, to saying, hey, we're all in this together, myself included, and make it more conversational and not pretending that I was an exception to the human condition. We're all in this together. This is teamwork, and let's figure this out together. So the whole tone of the manuscript changed.
Oh, and what were there any? Can you share any particular behaviors that changed in you, or is that what we're going to get into? Because we're going to be talking about strategies for creating a game plan. Is that sort of the topic there, or can you share anything any insights you learned from not dealing with your huge trauma?
Well, we'll get into it, but I think in Chapter 1 I introduced what I call the dynamic duo. There's numerous techniques to heal from trauma that are statistically correlated to healing, but the two most important I lay out right up front, and one of them is called grounding. It's deep breathing exercises, and my cardiologist told me about Sarah Lazar. She's out of Harvard, and there's over a dozen studies showing the effects of deep breathing exercises, whether you call it meditation or Lamaze or yoga, it really doesn't matter. But deep breathing exercises literally resets the amygdala in the brain, and you can actually measure the growth in the brain in healthy areas as a result of deep breathing exercises. So that's one of the things that came out of my experience. I
so identified because I have a morning ritual where I meditate and read something inspirational and journal on it, as an highly functional and very active working retired person. I do have my own schedule, and so in the mornings I'm able to spend significant time meditating and reading and journaling on that reading. And there is, your word grounding is grounding, anchoring, that is so critical. And I really am terrible at meditating. I have a monkey mind. My brain is going all over the where, but I am not moving. I don't scratch my nose. I don't do anything. It's 20 to 25 minutes, and I just sit there in silence. And out of my 20 minutes, I will have probably 7 minutes of non-interrupted thinking. But it is, friend said, well, what has it done for you? And I said, I don't know. I'm not really sure, but I can tell you this. I don't want to stop doing it. And I've been doing it for 5 years now. I've got several thousand hours of meditation, or hundreds of hours or something. I can't remember. But it is interesting that grounding aspect, and we don't have that, Randall. We just we get out of bed and we brush our teeth, change our clothes, eat breakfast, and we're at it without any kind of embracing and inviting the day into our life. Yeah. The early morning rituals are a great way to start the day off. They can be as simple as making your bed. I walked in the office once, and the PR person told me that there was an article in ESPN about my book, and one of the NFL stars had read it and said, that he attributed a lot of his success in the NFL to the habit he learned from my book, making your bed in the morning. So starting the day off right it really puts our brains and points us in the right direction. It puts our brains into a productive mindset. And of all the early morning rituals, even more important than making your bed is what you just described. It's deep breathing exercises. It physiologically completes the trauma cycle and resets the brain. I mean, this is brainwave measurable stuff. It's not hocus pocus. Yeah, that's fascinating. That truly is fascinating. Now, since you talked about the dynamic duo, that's one of the dynamic duo. I think before we're going to take a break, but before we take a break, I want to talk about your second of the dynamic duos, because I think that's exceedingly important.
Yeah, the other one is called Sitting in the Fire, and it's basically having uncomfortable conversations. Like I mentioned, it used to be for me very uncomfortable to talk about my open heart surgery. And
can I stop you there and tell me, why was that difficult for you to talk about?
It's just embarrassing. I mean, all little boys want to be the fastest in the races in the elementary school. I wasn't the fastest. I was sometimes I couldn't even finish the race because my circulation was so poor. And then I grew up in Southern California, and you go to the beach and you take your shirt off and there's a big scar on my back, and of course that's embarrassing from where I had the surgery. And so it's both a outward cosmetic thing and also an inward emotional insecurity about being defective. And what was interesting, Charlie, is that the doctors, when they did the surgery after their 1-year checkup, they patted me on the back and literally they said, "You're good to go, kids. You're all fixed. Go have a great life." And what they didn't do is deal with the emotional stuff I had been through from the time I was born till 11, of these constant trips to the doctor and this enormous ordeal of the open heart surgery. None of that was ever dealt with at any level, and that's what I had to figure out on my own, and that's part of why I wrote the book.
There's another book that is not on your subject, but is of the ilk of your subject, and it's written by Alain Baton, and it comes from his a group that he founded called the School of Life. And what he advocates is that we are never in school taught about how to emotionally deal with the situations in our life, that other than ignore them. And his book is brilliant when he talks about different emotions and how to handle them. Alain de Botton is really profound in that. You might really enjoy some of his reading. He's written books on marriage that are very, very, very powerful. But that as you said, in school, well, first of all, we're probably dealing with so many dramatically unhealthy teachers that are not ready to teach the subject, but that we teach nothing about how to handle anything emotionally.
Oh yeah, no, we know the Pythagorean theorem and geometry and science, and I'm not discounting the necessity to learn math and English, but part of the life skills we need and the skill set we need, which I think as a society worldwide we're deficient on, are, like you say, emotional skills, particularly, and at the very top of that list is trauma recovery. Because if we have the skill set, we can get past the addictions, drug addiction and anger addiction and alcohol and workaholism and all these things are all symptoms, and the root cause is unresolved trauma. We're trying to mask the pain from unresolved trauma. So if we would spend a little bit of time on that, the skills aren't terribly difficult. They're actually very simple, but they're very, very powerful. But they're of no use if we don't know what they are. I mean, like you say, just taking 25 minutes of deep breathing in the morning changes the course of a lifetime, and even 7 deep breaths in the elevator can reset the brain's amygdala. These skills, again, very simple but very powerful. They're not taught in school. That's why I'm on this crusade to get the word out.
Well, you've got a fellow crusader, because I really believe in what you're doing, and as an alcoholic, I understand the numbing of the trauma. I used to say this, that I never drank to get high. I drank to get normal. And so it would be like 2 glasses of wine would sort of settle down all of my trauma and anxieties. And I think you're bang on when you say we're trying to compensate for something. What I'd like to do is I'd like to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about strategies for creating a game plan for dealing with the impacts of trauma. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, let's take a break, Paul. Hi there, you're listening to Charlie Hedges in the Next Chapter with Charlie, and my very special guest today is Dr. Randall Bell, author of Post-Traumatic Thriving. And we're talking about how all of us, not just war vets, and certainly, the extreme that war vets go through, I can't even imagine, but that all of us have some kind of trauma that impacts us to the point of where Dr. Bell suggests that we run to one of those three alternatives of flight, fright, or freeze, and it just stops us from proceeding in our life. Now, Dr. Bell has written, as I said, this very, very, really good book, Post-Traumatic Thriving, The Art and Science of Stories of Resilience. In this book, Randall, you talk about, you have sort of three focus areas of dive, survive, and thrive. Can you talk to me about what those are about?
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. Dive is where we get knocked down. Survive is where we get back on our feet, and thrive is where we blast off. And in other words, we tap into the fuel of the trauma, but in a productive way, and do something remarkable that we didn't know we were even capable of. And that's really where the focus of the book is how to kind of repurpose our trauma into something really beneficial. And so along with the science and the art of trauma recovery, I followed the stories of about a dozen people. One of them is Jerry Jewell, who I went to high school with. And Jerry is disabled. She has cerebral palsy. And she was the first person to land a starring role on network television. She was on Facts of Life, if you remember that sitcom. And then more recently, she was in the Deadwood movie on HBO. And she was discovered by Norman Lear in a Hollywood comedy club. And so in spite of her handicap, she's done phenomenal things. And I'm good friends with her, and I asked her point blank, do you think you would have had this success in Hollywood had you not been disabled? And she didn't really think she would. That disability is really kind of what fueled her into doing something amazing.
My experience with a couple of people, and I'm even going to ask you for personal counseling at the end of our session, my experience with a couple of friends that are dealing with severe trauma in their lives, that they are in survival mode, but they're not doing a good job at survive. They're certainly not thriving. But survive is becoming a matter of somewhere between denial and then just reminiscing and living in sadness.
Yeah, it's easy to do. And self-pity, anger, all these depression, we can even get addicted to those emotions if we're not careful. That's why if you find yourself in a state of depression of any kind for more than 3 months, it's essential to seek professional help. Trauma recovery is not a solo exercise, and it's important to reach out and accept help, have some humility, or we're going to get stuck there. And it happens all the time, sadly.
Yeah, and you maybe we can go on a little bit more with sitting in the fire, because that's what I got as I was reading Sitting in the Fire. It is that place that dialogue about the specific issue is critical, and finding out that you're not alone, finding out that there are other alternatives, finding out it's just, you say whether it's a therapist or a good friend, you're not out there talking to the world about it, but you're talking to trustworthy people who have your best in mind. Can you elaborate on Sitting in the Fire apart from what I said?
Yeah, at a very minimum, until you find that trusted person, it's important to express it somehow. Your what's going on. So journaling is a great starting point. With using a trusted friend, that's dicey, because it can be it's definitely a good idea to express things, but remember, you can be traumatizing someone else by telling them about your traumas. So we got to be aware of that and not overdo it and not burn out a friendship over sharing our trauma with a trusted friend. But some people do that with great success. The optimal approach is a qualified trauma therapist, because they're licensed. If they divulge anything confidential, they lose their license, they lose their livelihood. So they're prone to keeping confidential information confidential. And also, they're trained. They know how to process the trauma and the hearing about the trauma without being taken underwater themselves. So, but whatever approach we do, we've got to do something to not bottle it up inside. When we keep it bottled up inside, what we do, Charlie, is we start an internal war. And that can manifest in all kinds of physical illnesses and all kinds of emotional mess. So it's essential we talk about it. It was very embarrassing when I started talking as an adult about what I went through as a kid with my open heart surgery. I relived the trauma. I mean, I would shake. I would feel that feeling of shock, that surge of emotion, that sheer embarrassment. It all came back. But by doing it, I healed. And now I'm telling you about it. I'm telling the whole world about it. It's in my book. But I don't get re-triggered. I'm totally healed from it. And I do it because hopefully somebody will say, hey, I get what this guy's talking about, and I need to do the same thing and unload my trauma.
How did you reduce the temptation or the result of falling prey to triggering? Because that is so, triggering happens and we don't even know that it happens. It's just, we'll all of a sudden feel some deep emotion, and we're not sure what that emotion is. We certainly don't think about what the cause of it is, but we're trying to deal with that emotion without dealing with the cause. But how did you come to about the point where you could look at this more objectively? Was that through therapy and good counseling?
Well, yeah, a ton of research. My cardiologist had a lot to do with my personal situation and having talks with her. But just giving that emotion a name, and that name, you just said it, it's triggering. Just being aware of, hey, when I hear this song, or when I drive by that building, or someone brings up such and such name, I feel triggered. I feel this flash of negative emotion and comfortableness. And that's classic triggering. And that can lead to, a whole host of the fallout we know that trauma can bring. So giving it a name, identifying it, being aware of your blood pressure, being aware of your breathing. If you find yourself in that uncomfortable state where you're breathing heavy, that's because we've been triggered. And that alone can kind of help people identify it and then do something about it, more importantly. I didn't even know what the word meant for most of my adulthood, but by giving it a name, calling it out for what it is 50% of the battle of fixing the whole thing.
Yeah, I a couple of thoughts come to mind. One is I like your wisdom approach of being careful to whom you share your traumatic experience, because they can either be triggered or they don't buy into it. I know people that have gone through severe trauma and had people say, well, you just need to get over it. This is just, it's been 2 years now, 3 years now. It's time to move on. Well, those are cute words, but they are not impactful, and they're really not helpful words, because they don't give any, what you offer, they don't give any strategies of how to do that, or tactics or actions.
Yeah, exactly. The whole get over it line, I'm guilty of it myself. I don't do it anymore, but being told get over it doesn't solve anything. If anything, it compounds the problem.
It does.
I used to say to my kids, I have 3 boys and a daughter, and I used to say to one of my sons, when he was playing basketball or football or whatever, and he'd get knocked down, I'd say, toughen up, Buttercup. And he told me later he hated that. It wasn't helpful, and he was absolutely right. And I was a product of, my parents, and that's what I heard. And we need to rethink these things and have I don't want to. I'm not advocating that we coddle everyone, but on the other hand, we have to be a little more sympathetic and empathetic to what people are going through.
Well, and perhaps even coddling is okay as an introductory step to say that, we need to, we'll do that and we'll show that we care and we'll show you our empathy. But there does need to be some personal change, and that's going to have to move us out of the stage of coddling into the stage of now what I want to talk about, something you write about that I really liked. It's a focus on building self-respect. And, this is taking care of the self. And, there are a couple of really great charts. I don't have, I think, 263 and 279 pages. There were a couple of really great charts on self-respect and passive-aggressive and aggressive and the different emotions that are around each of those: respect for others, respect for yourself, or disrespect for each. That was powerful stuff, Randall. I identified with that so much.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, there's as you see, there's lots of charts and diagrams in the book, because mind mapping, you can take these 150-page narratives and put them on one page with a really intelligent mind map or diagram to bring the point home. And so I do that a lot because the book's already 400 pages. It's too long as it is. Excuse me. But I wanted to drive these points home, and that's a way to make it presentation friendly and really download a lot of information efficiently.
How does one go about? Give me a process. How does one go about? Let's take the odd one from childhood. When I say the odd one, the one that's not mentioned regularly, but it is so profound, and that is shame. How does one move from an area of shame and unworthiness and move that into a place of self-respect, understanding? This either was all I was doing. I like to look at life this way, is that at various times I'm dealt a hand of cards, and I've got to play those cards, and those are the only cards I have. And then as life moves on, I get a different hand, and I see life differently. But at some point, you can only play with what you know until you are given other resources. And I think that's what you're bringing to the table in your book, is other resources for building this self-actualized, authentic understanding of who we are. And accepting, and there's this huge accepting and forgiveness of self.
Yeah, well, the overall architecture of the book is there's 3 sections: dive, survive, and thrive. We've talked about that. And then what I did is approximately, and I did some adjustments that made sense, but the first 5 or so chapters are the 5 stages of grief.
Right, Kubler-Ross.
And denial and anger. People typically land on depression, and those aren't my concepts. That comes from well-established psychology of the 5 stages of grief. But we got to work through each one at a time, and so that's what we do at the start of the book. And I tell people, don't skip ahead. Just take it one step at a time and process it one chapter at a time. There's 15 chapters, and then there's also a bunch of literature that most people don't know about. Out of University of North Carolina, called post-traumatic growth. And a lot of those concepts are the last 5 chapters of the book. And then what I did is I bridged them so we don't just jump immediately from grief to thriving. It's a little abrupt.
Right.
So we now have a step-by-step 15 steps in 3 different sections to work through intelligently, and that's basically the architecture, and that seems to really, really work. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, I've read this book, or my husband and I have read this book, and now we're reading it again because every time we go through a chapter, we just get better and better and better.
Oh,
and,
really?
Again, I'm not that bright, but what I did is I did a lot of research of people that have done a lot of research and compiled it into one place and made it accessible to the public rather than just, academic journals.
And this is something, by reading your book and doing the exercises, because there's several exercises, doing the exercises, one can do this without professional help. It's always accompanied, because I've been in therapy, man, since for 30 years I've been in therapy. So I'm a big advocate of psychotherapy, and I think I've not wasted my time. I've learned tremendous amounts from it, and in my whole life and in my everyday life. But this is something they can just do on their own. They don't have to have a therapist or an expert working with them. They can use your tactics and learn from them, right?
Well, yeah, I'm not and by the way, I've never claimed to be that. Of course, I'm not a therapist. I'm a sociologist and an economist. So, but I do know how to do research, and so that's the benefit of what I bring to the table. And yeah, some people have just read the book, gone through it, or they read it another person, or even book clubs. I've seen a lot of that. Some people read the book with their therapist, and they take it a chapter at a time with their therapist. I let people do whatever sounds best for them, but I always advocate that when you read the book, and it's fine if you read it by yourself, but find that trusted person like we talked about, so it's not bottled up inside.
Yeah, I have a couple people in my life like that. I have a seminary background, and there's a statement, a verse in the Bible in the letter of James, and he says, "Confess your sins to one another, in order that you may be healed." And healed, now, that's the sins and healed are, very biblical terms. But the idea of the confession of and he put it this way because he was dismissed from his position for shameful activities, for difficult activities. And he said, you know what? Confession blocks the blackmail of the lives of your deeply critical internal self. It blocks that. He put it in a way, in a biblical way. Satan, or that confession blocks the blackmail of Satan, but that blackmail is coming from the inner lives, from deep inside of me, that I am blackmailing myself. And confession and healing through other people are the it seems to me to be the route to self-acceptance. But if you do not confess it, if you do not get it out, like what you're saying, a trusted friend, if you do not get it out with the trusted friend, it just lays mired in muck that it won't escape until you can start talking about it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I guess I have 2 responses there. One is you brought up the issue of faith, and that's chapter 11. Faith in a higher power for a greater cause is really important to get into the thrive stage. That's the first point. And the second point is, yes, whether from scripture or psychology or science or academic studies, the need to get it out. It's kind of like, think about yourself, getting a deep cut and just putting a Band-Aid on it. Well, without opening it up and exposing it and clearing it out, we're just going to compound the problem. I mean, a lot of people have died from staph infections. So what we're really talking about is opening up the wound and cleaning it out. And then you can properly heal, but not really before. In fact, we just compound the problems.
Do you know how good that analogy is? You know that, right? You've used that analogy before. You must have, because it's in the book. It's a powerful analogy. That is, that until you open it up and clean it out, and we want to just cover it with funky, bleeding, pussy scabs, rather than actually healing that it can be removed. I like that. So look, my final question today is a personal question. So I'm going to use you as sociological analyst. How's that? Instead of psychological analyst, I'll call you a sociological analyst. And it's just that I happen to have a couple of friends that have lost young adult children and, under 30, and sort of in unexpected deaths. And I can hardly imagine, personally, I have a 30-year-old son that I'm extraordinarily close to, and I just can't even imagine the trauma of the death of a child that's a young child, and I'm still a healthy and active adult myself, even though I'm 73. I'm probably a reasonably young 73. What kind of advice do you have for parents that have gone through this trauma of losing young adult children?
Yeah, as a parent myself, I can't imagine what what people have gone through. Although that being said, I've lost a niece, which is very close to home, as a child, and in fact 2 nieces. And
I'm sorry.
Sometimes you don't have any words, just sympathy. But that being said, I worked on Sandy Hook's the school shooting. I worked on Pulse nightclub, where a lot of people lost their son, and numerous cases where there's been mass death, and it's unimaginable. And the essence of it comes down to proper grieving and honoring the victims in doing something productive at the appropriate time, doing something to remember them, keep them alive in our memories, and doing something that is a cause that they would be proud of. And I think that is where I see a lot of people landing that are handling that horrible situation as productively as possible, is accepting that you never get over something like that, but you do get through it through channeling that energy into something that would honor their loved ones and the loss of their loved ones.
Yeah, I read about it in a whole different subject matter, but it really is not even related to what we're talking about, except for this one statement that says, in order to move on, and this was written in church leadership, in order to move on, we must, it is essential to have a holy calling for the future. And to have, whether it's holy or meaningful, or that you're contributing to the value of society in the memory of your lost child, that would seem to me to be very healing.
Yeah, it is. I have a podcast myself. It has the same name, Post-Traumatic Thriving, and I host it with Nicole Brown Simpson's sister, Tanya Brown. And we had a guest on, Ken Druck, who lost his daughter in an accident when she was in India on her way to see the Taj Mahal. And Ken Druck is a psychiatrist, and I think he's been on. I know he's been on Oprah, I think numerous times. And he's, for somebody who's lost a child, while we're here to talk about my book, and I appreciate that, I would really encourage them to look up Ken Druck, Dr. Ken Druck, and he's got some books that really hit home with that loss, and he can speak to that issue because he's personally been through it. And what he said during our podcast was so profound. I would encourage people to listen to the podcast, get his books, because he's really the world's authority in that exact issue.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Well, Dr. Randall Bell, you what an insightful show. I knew this was going to be, and you can expect my my assistant to contact your assistant to talk about the other subject of money can buy happiness. I love that subject, just because it's counter to thought. That's really good. Thank you so much for being on the show, Randall.
Oh, you've been, Charles, such an honor to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you. And I have links to your pages and to your book that will be in the show notes, so people will be able to get a hold of you.
Great.
Okay, and I want to thank all our listeners for tuning in to the next chapter with Charlie. And until next, this is Charlie Hedges signing off. Bye for now.